Hello everyone, I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. Today I want to tell you about something that happened to me while working as a police officer. I've been on the force for 22 years. I started when I was 24 years old, fresh out of the academy, convinced that I understood how the world worked and where I fit in it. I believed in the law. I believed in the people around me. I believed most of all that I was a decent judge of character. That 2 decades of reading crime scenes, interviewing witnesses, and sitting across tables from people who had every reason to lie to my face had sharpened something in me. A kind of radar, an instinct. I want to tell you about the 18 months that shattered every one of those beliefs. About the case that started as a routine operation and ended with me sitting in a room on the wrong side of an interview table, watching 2 internal affairs investigators lay a folder in front of me and ask me, in the calmest possible voices, whether I had betrayed every oath I had ever taken. I want to tell you about my friend Marcus, but I need to start before Marcus. I need to start where this whole thing really began, which was not in any dramatic moment. It was not a discovery or a confrontation or a late-night phone call. It began the way most things in police work actually begin, with boredom and paperwork and a briefing room that smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet. It was early February. I'd been assigned 3 months earlier to a joint task force, federal and local, targeting a distribution network operating out of our region. We called it Operation Millstone in our internal documents. The network moved stolen goods, primarily high-value electronics and pharmaceutical inventory that had been hijacked from logistics companies. They were organized. They had been operating for at least 4 years before we formally identified them as a network rather than a collection of unrelated theft rings. What connected them was a logistics coordinator we had been calling Subject 1 in our reports, a man we suspected was warehousing and redistributing stolen inventory through a chain of legitimate-looking businesses. In those early weeks, I was not a central figure in the investigation. I was one of 8 officers assigned to surveillance and report preparation. I drove, I watched, I wrote up what I saw, I attended the briefings. I did not lead anything. I was not senior enough on this particular task force to be in the inner planning circle. I attended the morning briefings. I received the daily situation reports through our department's secure system. I logged in, read, filed, and went to work. That is important. I need you to understand that before anything else. I was a mid-level participant receiving standard distribution of intelligence. That matters enormously for what came later. The first sign that something was wrong came in the 3rd week of February. We had planned a coordinated surveillance of a warehouse on the eastern edge of the industrial district, a facility we believed was being used for short-term storage of stolen pharmaceutical stock. The plan called for 6 officers to establish fixed observation positions around the perimeter starting at 6 in the morning. The operation was scheduled on a Tuesday. On Monday night, 2 of our surveillance vehicles were spotted and identified by subjects in the area. By the time our people were in position Tuesday morning, the warehouse was empty and cleaned. Not just emptied of product, the interior had been wiped. Bleach smell, no fingerprints, no trace evidence beyond some tire marks in the gravel. We assumed at the time that it was coincidence or good instincts on their part. Criminal networks that survive long enough develop a kind of institutional paranoia. They rotate locations, they use lookouts, they move on short notice. None of us said the word leak yet. We were annoyed. We adjusted. We moved on. The second sign came in March. We had identified a courier, Subject 4, in our reports, who we believed was making regular handoffs between the distribution hub and a retail fence network operating across 3 counties. We had his vehicle, we had his schedule, we had 2 officers assigned to follow him on the 14th. At 9:17 that morning, Subject 4 called in sick to his legitimate employer, drove to a gas station, switched vehicles, and spent the day at his mother's house watching television. He never made a single move that looked criminal. Our people followed an innocent man to a suburban house and sat outside for 11 hours. That was the second sign. It was also the first time I heard the word leak spoken out loud in a professional context. Our task force commander, a federal agent named Brenda Calloway, used it at the debrief. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it as a hypothesis, the way you would say any word you are not yet ready to commit to. She said something was off. She said the network was behaving as though it knew we were watching. She said we needed to think carefully about information security. Nobody looked at me when she said it. Nobody had any reason to. I nodded along with everyone else, felt the same unease everyone in that room was feeling, and drove home that night thinking about the investigation, not about myself. That is what I keep returning to now, the complete absence of any self-awareness, the total blindness. Let me tell you about Marcus Webb. I met Marcus 17 years ago at a neighborhood block association meeting, the kind of community outreach event that police departments organize and officers dread attending. You go, you eat terrible baked goods, you answer questions from residents who are either very frightened or very angry, and you try to make the department look approachable. I went because my sergeant at the time required it. I sat at a table with a paper cup of lemonade, and Marcus sat down across from me because there were no other empty seats. He was not a police officer. He never had been. He worked in commercial property management. He handled lease agreements and tenant relations for a company that managed a portfolio of retail and warehouse spaces across the metro area. He was 32 years old, wore a blue button-down shirt with a coffee stain on the sleeve he had clearly tried to blot out, and he opened the conversation by asking me whether I thought the new stoplight at Kemper and Vine was going to help with the pedestrian crossing situation or whether the city had genuinely just wasted $20,000. That was Marcus. That was always Marcus. He had a way of walking directly into the practical center of any situation, bypassing the polite small talk, asking the exact question that cut through the noise. It was the thing I admired most about him for 17 years. We became friends the old-fashioned way, which is slowly and without either of us noticing it happening. A phone number exchanged, a conversation at a community meeting the following month, then a beer after a neighborhood meeting, then a standing invitation to his family's 4th of July barbecue. By the time his daughter Renata was born, I was at the hospital. When my mother died 8 years ago, Marcus drove 4 hours to attend the funeral without my having to ask. He came to my home regularly. He knew where I kept the spare key. He knew my alarm code because I had given it to him years ago when I needed him to let in a plumber while I was working a double shift. He sat at my kitchen table. He ate at my dining room table. He played cards with my brother. He watched basketball on my couch. He was, as far as I knew, a property manager who coached Little League on weekends and complained about his homeowners association and took his family to the Outer Banks every August. I want you to hold that image, because for the next several months of the investigation, I was going to be holding it too, while everything around it slowly, horribly dissolved. In April, Agent Calloway brought in internal affairs. She had no choice. The pattern of failures was too consistent to ignore. We had now experienced 4 separate operational compromises, 4 instances where subjects appeared to have advanced knowledge of surveillance or enforcement activity. She documented the pattern and took it to our department's deputy chief, who convened a meeting I was not invited to. 2 days later, I was called into that meeting as an informational participant, not a suspect. We were all told that an information security review was being conducted. We were told that operational details would be further compartmentalized. We were told to be careful about what we discussed and with whom. I went home that night feeling the professional discomfort that every honest officer feels when someone suggests there might be a dirty cop in the unit. I did not think I was the problem. I did not think any of my close colleagues were the problem. I thought about which officers on the task force I knew less well. I thought about federal agents I barely knew. I thought about administrative staff who might have access to the system. I thought about 100 different things that were not myself. I did not think about Marcus. Why would I? He was a property manager. He had no connection to the investigation. He had no connection to law enforcement beyond being my friend. The idea that Marcus Webb had any relationship to Operation Millstone would have been, in April, so far outside the boundaries of my imagination that it genuinely would not have occurred to me if someone had asked me to guess every possible explanation for the leak. The Internal Affairs Review began quietly. They assigned 2 investigators to it, a man named Roland Duchamp and a woman named Teresa Nungsel. I encountered them briefly in mid-April at the precinct. Duchamp had been with Internal Affairs for 9 years. He was tall, unhurried, and spoke with the particular careful cadence of someone who had learned to say very little while appearing to say a great deal. Ung was younger, sharper, and had a habit of watching your hands when you talked that I noticed immediately and found professionally unnerving. I shook hands with both of them. I told them I was glad someone was looking into it. I meant it. They smiled politely. Looking back, I wonder now whether they were already looking at me, whether my file was already on the table in whatever room they were using, whether those polite smiles meant anything at all. The month of May brought the moment that changed everything for me personally, the one I was completely unprepared for. We had identified a new target, a man named Derek Holt, who we believed was the primary logistics coordinator we had been calling Subject 1. He was 41 years old, operated a legitimate-looking freight consulting business, and had been careful enough to avoid any direct connection to the theft network for 4 years. We found him through a combination of financial analysis and a witness statement from a man we arrested on unrelated charges who was willing to trade information for consideration. Holt's name was circulated internally on a need-to-know basis on May 2nd. I received the document with his name and photograph on the morning of May 3rd. I read his file. I sat at my desk for a moment in a way that I hoped did not look unusual from across the office, because I recognized Derek Holt. Not well, not intimately, but I had seen his face before, at close range, in a context that had nothing to do with stolen pharmaceutical inventory or freight consulting. I had seen Derek Holt at Marcus Webb's backyard barbecue 2 summers ago. He had been introduced to me as a friend of Marcus's from his commercial real estate days. We had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes about nothing: college football, the weather, whether the local mall was going to survive the next 3 years. I remembered him vaguely as a quiet, self-contained man who had declined a second beer and left the party early. I had thought nothing of it then and had never thought about him since. Now I was looking at his photograph on my computer screen and reading a federal investigative summary describing him as the central organizing figure in a 4-year criminal conspiracy. I need to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment. It was not a clean, logical sequence of deductions. It was chaos. It was the sudden sensation of the ground not being where I expected it. I thought, this is a coincidence. I thought, lots of people know lots of people. I thought, Marcus has hundreds of acquaintances through his property management work. I thought all of those things quickly and urgently, the way you think things when part of you already knows they are not sufficient. Then I thought, I need to tell someone about this. And then I thought, no, wait, let me think about what I actually know. What I knew was that my friend had been at the same party as a man who was now a federal investigation target. That was it. That was the full extent of my knowledge. It could be entirely innocent. People in commercial real estate and property management routinely cross paths with freight and logistics operators. It was not unusual. It was not evidence of anything. But I stayed at my desk for longer than I usually would have, and I stared at the photograph longer than I needed to, and when I finally turned away, I felt something that I can only describe as a cold knot sitting very still in my chest. I did not tell anyone that day. I told myself I needed more information first. I told myself I was protecting Marcus from an unfair association. I told myself that bringing his name into an investigation on the basis of one coincidental party encounter was irresponsible and potentially harmful to an innocent person. I told myself a lot of things. Some of them were probably true. The investigation continued. In late May, we attempted another coordinated action, an intercept of a vehicle transport we believed was moving stolen electronics. We positioned ourselves carefully. We used a smaller information distribution than usual because of the security concerns. Only 4 people on the task force knew the full operational plan 24 hours in advance. The transport changed routes 40 minutes before our intercept point. We missed it by 11 miles. Duchamp and Ung were in the building within 48 hours. I had a brief informal conversation with Duchamp in a hallway, the kind of conversation that feels casual and probably is not. He asked me how the task force was holding up morale-wise. He asked whether I had noticed anything unusual in the period leading up to the failed intercept. He asked whether my information access had been normal recently or whether I had experienced any system issues. That last question. I remember the way he phrased it. System issues, not security issues, not access issues, system issues. I told him everything had been normal. He thanked me and walked away. That night I drove to a bar I did not usually go to, sat alone at the far end of the counter, and drank 2 beers very slowly while thinking about Marcus and Derek Holt and a barbecue 2 summers ago and the cold knot that had not left my chest since May 3rd. The following morning I requested a meeting with Agent Calloway and told her about Derek Holt and the party. She thanked me for coming forward. She wrote something down. She told me she would follow up on it. She did not tell me whether this information was new to the investigation or whether it confirmed something they already suspected. Her face gave me nothing at all, which is the sign of a genuinely excellent investigator. I walked out of her office feeling both better and worse than when I had walked in. Better because I had done the right thing. Worse because doing the right thing had now formally put Marcus Webb's name in a federal investigation file. I called Marcus that afternoon. I did not tell him about the investigation. I could not tell him about the investigation. I told him I was thinking about coming over that weekend, maybe Saturday, if he and his family were around. He said, absolutely. Come for dinner. Pauline was making her short ribs. Bring yourself and leave work at the office. I said I would. I did not go. I told him that Saturday morning that something had come up at work, and I would try for the following weekend. He said, no problem. Text me when you know. He sounded completely normal. He sounded exactly like Marcus. He sounded like a man who had nothing to hide. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the specific texture of the confusion I was living in. I was not watching a stranger. I was not following a cold lead. I was navigating the possibility that one of the most familiar people in my world was something entirely different from what I believed. And the maddening thing was that nothing about him looked different. He still sounded like Marcus. He still laughed like Marcus. He still talked about Renata's soccer games and Pauline's cooking and the homeowners association. The knot in my chest got tighter. In June, everything accelerated and then collapsed at once. The federal side of the investigation made a significant evidence break on a financial trail they had been following for months. I was not in the room when it happened, but the news moved through the task force quickly. They had found a connection between Derek Holt's freight consulting business and a series of property management transactions. Commercial leases, warehouse space, the same kind of work Marcus did for a living. I found out about this on a Thursday. On Friday morning, Agent Calloway called me into her office, and this time Duchamp and Ung were both present. They asked me to sit down. Calloway told me that the investigation had developed in a direction that required them to ask me some direct questions. She told me that I was not at that moment a suspect or subject of any investigation, and that I was free to request representation. She told me this formally, carefully, in the specific way. That means the thing she is saying is technically true, while other things remain carefully unspoken. I told her I did not need representation. I told her to ask me what she needed to ask. Duchamp opened a folder. He took out a printed sheet and turned it to face me. It was a system access log from our department's secure network. It showed login activity on my assigned computer terminal. He pointed to a series of entries from the previous 18 months. He asked me whether I recognized the access pattern. I looked at it. On the surface, it looked like my access pattern, my login credentials, my terminal. The dates and times lined up with times I had been at the office. But there were entries at times I did not recognize. Late evenings. One entry on a Saturday morning when I was certain, absolutely certain, that I had been out of town at my brother's place 300 miles away. I told him that. I told him I was out of town on that Saturday. I told him I had not logged in from my terminal on any of the late evenings he was pointing to. He wrote something down and asked me whether my login credentials were stored anywhere other than my memory, written down somewhere, on a personal device, shared with anyone. I told her no. I told her my credentials were in my head only. I had never written them down. I had never shared them with anyone. She asked me whether my department-issued computer was ever left on and unattended in a space where someone other than me could have accessed it. I started to say no, and then I stopped, because a memory arrived that I was not ready for. My computer, my home. The evening 2 years ago when I had brought my laptop home because I was working on a case file and needed to access the secure network remotely through the department VPN. I had set it up on my kitchen table. Marcus had been there that evening. He had come over to watch a game. I had worked for a while before the game started, and at some point I had gotten up to get drinks from the refrigerator, and I had left the laptop sitting open on the table, logged in, while Marcus sat in the next room for maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. I sat in that office chair looking at Ung's face, and I felt the ground disappear completely. I told them about that evening. I told them exactly what I remembered. I told them that I could not be certain what had happened during the minutes I was out of the room, but that it was theoretically possible for someone to have accessed the machine. Duchamp wrote something down without looking up. I asked them directly, "Is Marcus Webb a subject of this investigation?" Calloway said that she was not in a position to discuss who was or was not a subject of the investigation at this time, which was, as any police officer knows, an answer. I drove home that evening in a state that I can only describe as a kind of stunned suspension. I was not panicking. I was not crying. I was operating on some automatic level that kept the car in the correct lane and stopped at red lights, while somewhere in a deeper part of my mind an 18-month review was underway. Every interaction, every evening, every visit, every occasion when Marcus had been in my home, running like a very slow, very thorough fire through everything I thought I knew. The process of being investigated by internal affairs is one that I understood professionally and had explained to others. I had sat with officers who were going through it. I had expressed sympathy and confidence and counsel. I had told people that if they had nothing to hide, the process would exonerate them. I had believed that when I said it. Living it was something entirely different. Within a week of that meeting, I became aware that the department's attitude toward me had changed. Nothing was said directly. No one accused me of anything. But there is a texture to a precinct when someone is under scrutiny that any experienced officer can feel. Conversations that stopped a fraction of a second before they normally would when I entered a room. A colleague who had eaten lunch with me twice a week for 3 years, suddenly finding himself busy every day. My task force assignments being quietly reduced to minimal peripheral work. Access to the investigation's current intelligence updates going from daily to a summary once a week. I understand all of that professionally. I would have implemented the same measures if the positions were reversed. You cannot allow a potentially compromised officer to continue receiving sensitive intelligence during a review of their conduct. It is the correct procedure. It is the only responsible course of action. It still felt like walking into a building and watching the lights go out one by one in front of you. The formal internal affairs interview came 11 days later. I sat in a room with Duchamp and Ung for 3 hours and 40 minutes. They were thorough. They were professional. They were not unkind. They asked me about every document I had accessed in the previous 2 years, every briefing I had attended, every operational plan I had received. They asked me about Marcus Webb in detail, how we met, how the friendship developed, how often he had been in my home, whether he had ever asked me questions about my work. That last question stopped me. Had Marcus ever asked me questions about my work? Every police officer has a version of the same conversation with every civilian friend. You are asked what you do, you give the general answer. You are asked about interesting cases, you deflect or generalize. People are curious about police work. It is normal. It has always been normal. But sitting in that room, I was being asked to remember not just whether Marcus had asked, but what he had asked and how he had asked it, and whether the pattern of his curiosity, viewed over 17 years, looked different than it had always appeared. And here is the thing I had to admit to Duchamp and Ung, sitting in that room. I could not fully reconstruct the pattern. I had not been cataloging it. I had not been treating conversations with my closest friend as evidence to be preserved. I had answered his questions the way you answer a friend's questions. Openly, comfortably, without the filtering process you apply with strangers. I had talked about my work with Marcus the way I talked about everything with Marcus, which was honestly and without much reservation. How many times had I mentioned operational neighborhoods without giving specifics? How many times had I referenced a surveillance schedule in passing? I'm working early Tuesday, some logistics thing, without thinking twice about it. How many times had I complained about a missed operation without explaining the details, but providing enough texture that an attentive person could piece something together? I sat in that room, and I honestly did not know, and not knowing was, in its own way, a kind of answer that made me deeply physically sick. Ung asked me, toward the end of the interview, whether I had ever logged into the secure network from outside my home, from a coffee shop, a hotel, a location where others might have observed my screen or credentials. I told her yes, several times over the years at a hotel when traveling, once at a coffee shop near the precinct that had reliable Wi-Fi when our building's network was down. She asked whether I had been careful about screen visibility and credential security in those locations. I told her I believed I had been. She nodded and wrote something down. After the interview, I sat in my car in the parking structure for 20 minutes. I was thinking about the Saturday access entry on the log, the one from when I was out of town at my brother's place. If it was genuinely my credentials used from my terminal, then someone had to have physically been at my desk, in the precinct, using my machine. Or the entry represented something else, a credential compromise that allowed remote access, or a logging error, or something I did not yet understand. But the evening at my house, Marcus at my kitchen table, 10 minutes, the laptop open and logged in, that was not a logging error. That was a window. That was an opportunity. And I was beginning to understand, with a slow and nauseating clarity, that Marcus Webb was the kind of man who recognized an opportunity when he saw one. I need to tell you what the investigation eventually established about how the information had actually moved, because this is the part that took the longest to untangle, and the part that, once I understood it, made me feel the most completely, helplessly stupid. Marcus had not hacked anything. He was not a technical expert. He had not installed software or exploited any vulnerability that required specialized knowledge. What he had done was far simpler, far more patient, and far more dependent on something that no security protocol can entirely protect against. He had trusted me back. When he sat at my kitchen table that evening 2 years before, with the laptop open and me in the kitchen, he had not done anything dramatic. He had looked at the screen. He had seen that I was logged into the department's network, and he had memorized my login credentials, the username and password that were visible in the session or retrievable through simple observation of what I had typed. That was it. That was the entire technical component of the compromise. He watched what I typed and he remembered it. Over the following months, he used those credentials not from my terminal, but from a laptop he had purchased with cash and kept specifically for this purpose to access the department's secure briefing system during hours when he knew I was awake and working so that the access times would not look entirely anomalous. He read operational plans, he read surveillance schedules, he read target information. He did not download documents or leave obvious traces because he was careful about exactly that. He read and he remembered and he passed what he needed to pass along. The Saturday access entry, the one from when I was out of town, was a mistake. He had misjudged. He had accessed the system on a Saturday morning, assuming I was in town as usual, not knowing I had left Friday night. That was the entry that flagged most clearly as anomalous in the log analysis. The reason his activity was not caught sooner was partly his caution and partly a gap in the department's monitoring systems that the Internal Affairs Review would eventually document as a significant operational vulnerability. The system logged access, but the anomaly detection threshold was set too high to flag occasional off-pattern accesses. It was designed to catch sustained, unusual patterns, not one-off incidents spread across months. So for 18 months, Marcus Webb had been reading our investigation from the inside. Not everything. He did not have access to the federal side's intelligence systems, but enough. Enough to tip off Derek Holt when a warehouse needed to be emptied. Enough to let Subject 4 know he was being followed on a given Tuesday. Enough to reroute a transport vehicle 40 minutes before an intercept. Enough to cost us 4 operations. Enough to let a criminal network continue operating for a year and a half longer than it should have. I did not learn all of this immediately. I learned it in pieces over the course of weeks while still under review myself. Duchamp and Ng were thorough, but they were not going to share investigative conclusions with the subject of their review in real time. I learned some of it from colleagues who were willing to talk carefully. I learned some of it from the formal conclusion of the Internal Affairs Review when it was finally provided to me. I learned the last pieces, the truest and most personal pieces, from Marcus himself. But before I get to that, I need to tell you about the day the warrant was served. It was a Thursday in early August. I was not part of the service team. I was told about it afterward. Federal agents and task force officers went to Marcus's office at 9 in the morning with a second team going simultaneously to his home. They executed search warrants on his business premises, his home office, and 3 vehicles. They arrested him at his office at 9:14. I was at the precinct when it happened. I was sitting at my desk doing administrative work that I had been left to do because everything else had been pulled from me. My phone stayed in my pocket. Nobody called me. Nobody texted me. I would have expected at least one person to call, even just to tell me it was done. Nobody did, and the silence told me more clearly than any statement could exactly what my colleagues currently thought about the reliability of any communication that passed through me. I found out from a local news alert at 11:47 that morning, a brief item about an arrest related to a regional theft ring investigation. Marcus's name was not yet public, but the description of the suspect's occupation was enough. I sat with that for a long time. Pauline called me that afternoon, Marcus's wife. She was not angry. She was something worse than angry. She was bewildered and frightened, and she asked me whether I knew what was happening, whether I could tell her anything, whether this was some kind of mistake. I told her I could not discuss an active investigation. I told her she should contact a lawyer immediately. I told her I was sorry. She asked me, "Did Marcus ever say anything to you about this?" I told her no. I told her he had never said a word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to think about what that means about who I have been living with." I told her I understood. I told her I was having the same conversation with myself about my best friend. She thanked me. She hung up. I went to the men's room, ran cold water over my face for a while, and then went back to my desk and continued the administrative work. The Internal Affairs review reached its formal conclusion in late August. I was called in for a final meeting with Duchamp and Ung and the deputy chief. Duchamp read through the summary findings. The review had established with high confidence that the unauthorized access to department systems had originated from an external device using credentials that had been compromised through a non-technical means. Specifically, direct observation of an officer's login process during a period of unsecured terminal access. He paused on that phrase, unsecured terminal access. He continued. The review found no evidence that Officer Loxley had shared credentials intentionally, had coordinated with any subject of the investigation, or had acted in any way to facilitate the compromise. The review found, however, that the access opportunity identified in the investigation resulted from a lapse in personal information security practices, specifically the use of a department-issued secured computer in an unsecured domestic environment in the presence of a civilian who was subsequently identified as a subject of criminal investigation. The deputy chief said, "The conclusion of Internal Affairs is that Officer Loxley was the victim of a credential theft, not a participant in any scheme. The review is closed with no disciplinary action in respect to the underlying conduct. However," that word, however. He continued, "there would be a formal counseling note in my file regarding information security practices. I would be required to complete additional information security training. There would be a review of my current assignments going forward." I told him I understood and accepted all of it. He told me I was free to return to normal duty. He told me the department considered the matter closed. Duchamp caught me in the hallway outside. He did not say anything particularly elaborate. He said, "For what it's worth, you came forward about the party connection when you didn't have to, and that accelerated things considerably." He said that mattered. I thanked him. He nodded and walked back toward his office. I spent the rest of that day trying to feel relieved and mostly failing. The word that keeps coming back to me when I think about that period is suspended. I was suspended between two versions of the last 17 years. In one version, Marcus Webb was exactly who I thought he was. A good man, a true friend, someone who had been present for the genuine moments of my life. In the other version, Marcus Webb was a man who had spent years cultivating my friendship with an eye toward its utility, who had sat at my kitchen table and watched me type my login credentials and file that information away, who had read the confidential plans of the organization I served and sold them to criminals. The problem, the specific psychological problem, is that both versions are real. They are not alternatives. They are simultaneous. Marcus was both of those people. The Marcus who drove 4 hours to my mother's funeral was the same man who watched my screen that evening in my kitchen. The man who coached Little League and worried about the HOA was the same man who tipped off Derek Holt when a warehouse needed clearing. How do you hold that? How do you put those two things in the same space? I have had 2 years since then to think about it, and I still do not have a clean answer. What I do have is what Marcus told me when I finally saw him. He was out on bail pending trial. The charges were federal, serious, but the judge had set conditions, and his attorney had argued successfully for release. I called his cell phone. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. I told him I wanted to talk. Not as a police officer, not as a witness or an investigator. I told him I wanted to understand. He said he had been waiting for that call. We met at a park, neutral ground, somewhere neither of us lived near. I wore civilian clothes. I left my phone in the car because I did not want him to think I was recording, and also because I did not want to record it. I wanted to hear it as a human being, not preserve it as evidence. He looked like Marcus. He looked tired and he had lost some weight, and there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. Something watchful and flattened, but he looked like the man I had known for 17 years. He was wearing a gray jacket. He had a paper coffee cup in his hand. We sat on a bench. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then he said, "I know you want me to tell you it wasn't about you." I asked him whether it was. He said, "The friendship was real. I need you to hear that first. Whatever else I tell you, the friendship was real." I told him to keep going. He told me about how it started. 6 years ago, not 2 years ago, not when he watched my screen, but 6 years ago, he had gotten into serious financial trouble. Not ordinary trouble. The kind of trouble that comes from borrowing money from the wrong people to cover losses in a business venture that did not work out. He owed a significant sum to a man who was connected to the network Derek Holt would eventually organize. He had been given a choice between a debt he could not pay and an arrangement. The arrangement was simple. He had access to commercial and warehouse properties through his property management work. He could facilitate temporary storage arrangements, legitimate-looking leases for spaces that would be used to move stolen inventory, with paperwork that looked clean and principles that looked legitimate. He was not asked to steal anything. He was not asked to be present for any criminal activity. He was asked to be a useful piece of infrastructure, and in return his debt was erased, and he was paid a percentage going forward. He told himself it was a one-time thing, then it was a short-term thing, then it was simply the way his life was structured, and he had stopped being able to imagine an alternative. I asked him when the information started. He said, "That came later. That came when Holt started getting nervous about exposure. That came when someone in Holt's operation became aware that a task force had been formed. And that came," he paused here and looked at me directly, "that came when it occurred to someone that I had a close friend on that task force." I asked him whether he had volunteered me or whether they had come to him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "They came to me with the idea, but I didn't say no fast enough." That sentence. I didn't say no fast enough. I have thought about it many times since. It is the most honest thing he said to me that afternoon, and also the most devastating. He did not say I refused. He did not say I agreed. He said he did not say no fast enough, which means he thought about it, which means there was a moment, however brief, where he sat with the knowledge that his friend trusted him, that his friend's laptop was sometimes in reach, that his friend's life was now a resource that someone was asking him to exploit, and he decided that the discomfort of that knowledge was something he could manage. I asked him about that evening, the kitchen, the laptop, the 10 minutes. He said he had not planned it that night specifically. He said when he saw the laptop open and I left the room, he had made a decision in a few seconds that he had been circling for weeks. He said he had not felt good about it. I asked him whether feeling bad about it had made any difference. He did not answer that. He asked me whether I hated him. I told him I did not know yet. I told him that hating him would require me to fully believe in the second version of him, and that I was not yet finished grieving the first. He looked at his coffee cup for a while. He said, "I convinced myself that what you would lose was minimal. Information, plans, a few missed operations. I told myself nobody would get hurt." I asked him whether he knew that 2 officers on the task force had been reassigned under adverse circumstances following the operational failures. Whether he knew that a witness who had provided information to us, the man who named Holt, had his protection arrangement compromised because the network was tipped that we had a cooperator. Whether he knew that witness was currently in another state living under an assumed name because returning to his actual life had become too dangerous. Marcus did not know all of that. His face said he did not know all of that. I told him, "Nobody got physically hurt, but the idea that what you did was minimal, that was also a decision you made about what counted." He did not argue with me. We sat on that bench for another 30 minutes. We did not say very much. At some point, he told me that Pauline had taken Renata and gone to stay with her sister. He told me he did not know whether that was temporary. He told me he had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the arrest. When I stood up to leave, he stood up too. He extended his hand. I looked at it for a moment, then I shook it, not because it felt like the right gesture, but because I did not know what the right gesture was, and doing nothing felt worse. He said, "I'm sorry, Cedric. I know that's not enough." I told him he was right that it was not enough. I told him I believed him anyway. I walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for about 15 minutes. The trial is still pending as I record this. Marcus's attorney has indicated that he plans to cooperate fully, which means a plea agreement is likely. Derek Holt and 3 other members of the network have already entered guilty pleas. The stolen goods operation has been dismantled, though whether entirely is something I am appropriately skeptical about. Criminal networks rarely collapse completely. They fracture and reconstitute and find new infrastructure. I returned to active duty in September. The reception was not triumphant. The information security counseling note is in my file. The assignments I lost during the review period did not all come back immediately. A few colleagues who were warm before are professionally polite now, which in a precinct is a meaningful difference. The trust that gets damaged during an internal review does not fully repair on the schedule you hope for, and I have come to accept that some of it will not repair at all. What I carry now, and will carry for as long as I'm a police officer, is a specific kind of professional humility that I did not have before. I was proud, in the way veteran officers sometimes become proud, of my instincts. my judgment, my ability to read situations and people accurately. I had built 17 years of friendship on the basis of that pride, on the certainty that I understood Marcus Webb, that I understood what kind of person he was, that the evidence of his character that I had accumulated over all those years of barbecues and basketball games and funerals and ordinary evenings was conclusive. None of it was conclusive. Some of it was real. Some of it was real alongside something else I did not see and was not looking for. The thing I find hardest, the thing I turn over most often and cannot set down cleanly, is not the betrayal itself. Betrayals happen. People contain multitudes, and not all of them are the ones you choose to see. The thing I find hardest is the laptop on the kitchen table, the 10 minutes in the kitchen, the understanding that the opportunity did not arise through any dramatic act of deception. It arose through the ordinary texture of a trusted friendship. Marcus was in my home because I wanted him there. The laptop was on the table because I was working comfortably, the way you work when you are at home, unself-consciously, without the armor of professional caution. Security protocols exist, and I know them, and I taught some of them, and I violated them not out of negligence, but out of comfort, out of the completely human failure of not imagining that comfort itself could be weaponized. If there is anything I would want another officer to take from this, anything at all, it is that. Not the dramatic lessons, not the obvious ones about not sharing credentials or not bringing work home. The lesson beneath those lessons, the one that says the most dangerous vulnerabilities are not technical, they are relational. They live in the spaces between people, in the silences during ordinary evenings, in the 10 minutes you spend in the kitchen getting drinks for someone you love while everything you have spent your career protecting sits open on the table. I think about Marcus often. I do not think about him with hatred. I think about him with a sadness that has a specific weight to it. A grief that is not like any other grief I have experienced because it does not have a clear object. I am not grieving a person who died. I am grieving a friendship that was real and also something else simultaneously, and the mathematics of that, the genuine and the corrupt existing in the same space, adding up to something I cannot fully calculate. That is what I live with. Renata, his daughter, sent me a message a few weeks ago. She is 22 now, finishing her degree. She said she did not know what to say, but that she wanted me to know she was sorry for what happened, and that she remembered the time I had taught her to ride a bike when she was 6 years old in her parents' driveway, and that this was confusing for her. I wrote back and told her that nothing that happened between her father and me should alter her memory of that afternoon. That afternoon was real, and it belonged to her. I told her I was sorry for everything she was going through, and that none of it was her fault or her responsibility. She wrote back, "Thank you. That actually helped. I have spent 22 years learning that police work is not about heroes and villains arranged on opposite sides of a clear line. I know this intellectually. I have always known it. The line is blurred and mobile and crossed and recrossed, and the people who cross it are rarely the strangers we imagine. They are often enough to matter, the people sitting at our kitchen tables. I did not know that the way I know it now. I know it now in my chest, in the cold knot that has not entirely gone away. I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. Thank you for listening.